Joe Rogan is the most powerful independent voice in modern media. That statement alone makes people uncomfortable, not because it's controversial, but because it forces a comparison most systems would rather avoid. He reaches more people than cable news ever did in its prime, more than most politicians, more than almost any journalist alive. And yet, he remains exactly where he is. Not canceled, not removed, not meaningfully constrained. In a media environment known for deplatforming, demonetizing, and marginalizing voices far smaller than his, Rogan remains untouched. Which raises a question almost no one asks. Not whether Joe Rogan is good or bad, not whether you agree with him, but why the system seems perfectly comfortable with him. Because once you understand how power actually works in modern media, Joe Rogan stops being a mystery. He becomes a case study, from outsider to institution. It's important to start here. Joe Rogan did not begin as a media insider. He didn't come from journalism. He wasn't trained by legacy institutions. His background was entertainment, comedy, mixed martial arts, and conversation. That outsider status matters. It's part of why his rise felt organic. Long-form conversations, minimal editing, an atmosphere that felt unscripted and informal. Compared to the polished talking heads on television, Rogan felt real. And for a long time, that authenticity was genuine. But systems don't care about intent, they care about function. Once an independent voice reaches a certain scale, the environment around them changes. Not because of ideology, but because of risk management. At massive reach, a voice becomes either destabilizing or useful. Rogan became useful. Power doesn't silence everything. It filters. One of the biggest myths about censorship is that power tries to silence all dissent. That's not how modern systems operate. Silencing everything creates backlash, martyrs, resistance, attention. Filtering is far more effective. Modern power doesn't ask, who should we shut up? It asks, which voices are safe to amplify? Safe doesn't mean agreeable, it means non-structural. Joe Rogan challenges people. He challenges narratives. He questions cultural assumptions. He hosts controversial guests. He allows taboo ideas into conversation. But notice what almost never happens. The conversation rarely consolidates into a coherent critique of systems themselves. Power structures are discussed as concepts, personalities, or events, not as interconnected mechanisms demanding reform. That distinction is everything. The safe bandwidth of dissent. Every system operates within a bandwidth of acceptable criticism. This bandwidth is not accidental, it is a structural necessity. Too little dissent breeds suspicion, erodes trust, and makes people feel silenced. On the other hand, too much dissent overwhelms the system, destabilizes authority, and risks coordinated resistance. The balance lies in creating a controlled space for opposition, not in the conspiratorial sense of manipulation, but in the functional sense of maintaining equilibrium. It is a mechanism that allows frustration to be expressed, grievances to be aired, and questions to be asked, but without ever crossing into the territory of organized disruption. Joe Rogan exemplifies this bandwidth perfectly. His platform feels wide enough to give the impression of rebellion, of pushing boundaries, of questioning mainstream narratives. Yet it remains narrow enough to avoid genuine threat to the structures of power. He provides a release valve, a place where audiences can feel like they are challenging authority, while in reality never fully interrogating how authority operates or sustains itself. This is not a critique of him personally, but a structural observation. Systems do not need to dictate what people think. They only need to shape the range of conclusions people are permitted to reach. Incentives decide outcomes, not intentions. At this point, people often ask the wrong question. They ask whether Joe Rogan is aware of this role. That question doesn't matter. Systems don't require awareness. They require incentives. A 9-figure platform deal doesn't buy silence. It buys alignment. Not ideological alignment, but operational alignment. Stability. Predictability, risk management. Rogan can talk about corruption, he can talk about elites, he can even flirt with taboo ideas. But there's a line that almost never gets crossed. The moment critique moves from personalities and events into structural demands, money flows, institutional architecture, enforceable accountability, consequences begin. That's not where Rogan operates, and that's why he's allowed to exist at this scale. Why others don't make it this far. Instead of asking, why Joe Rogan? A better question is, why not everyone else? Look at what happens to voices that move past culture and into structure. Journalists who follow financial networks lose reach. Whistleblowers vanish from feeds. Independent platforms see sudden algorithmic decay. Not loudly, quietly. Joe Rogan doesn't, because his role isn't to build a map of power, it's to host conversations inside it. Others try to connect dots. That's when pressure appears. This isn't about courage or cowardice, it's about design. Fragmentation as stability. Here's where the pattern becomes undeniable. Joe Rogan keeps conversations fragmented, not intentionally, not maliciously, but functionally. Each guest arrives alone. Each idea is explored in isolation, and each claim floats freely without ever being stitched into a larger framework. One episode might contradict another, yet the contradictions are never reconciled. Nothing accumulates, nothing coheres, and that fragmentation matters. Systems don't fear questions, they fear connections. A scattered set of doubts is manageable, it even feels liberating. But when those doubts begin to link together, when curiosity turns into coordination, that's when authority feels pressure. Rogan's format ensures curiosity remains safely contained. He opens the door wide enough for exploration, but never wide enough for synthesis. That's why he can host almost anyone. That's why almost anything can be said. The fragmentation acts as insulation. No matter how provocative a guest might sound, their ideas remain quarantined within a single conversation. The audience may feel rebellious, but they're not building a movement. They're consuming fragments. Rogan's centrality depends on this balance. He's the perfect outlet for frustration. Expansive enough to feel daring, yet structured enough to remain non-threatening. He doesn't map how authority functions. He simply provides a stage where authority can be questioned in passing. And that's the genius of the format. You don't need to control what people think. You only need to control the range of conclusions they're allowed to reach, and fragmentation does that job flawlessly. Not a puppet, a pressure valve. This is the part that reframes everything. Joe Rogan isn't a rebel, and he isn't a puppet. He's a pressure valve, a place where distrust is released, where anger is aired, where suspicion is voiced without being organized. That's why he feels dangerous, and why he's tolerated. Pressure valves prevent explosions. They don't fix the system, they stabilize it. The audience's role in the machine. Here's the uncomfortable part most people avoid. The audience helps enforce this structure. Viewers reward curiosity without consequence. They share clips, not frameworks. They prefer reaction to resolution. Outrage feels like participation. Listening feels like action. And so the loop continues. The mistake isn't listening to Joe Rogan. The mistake is stopping there. What real power looks like. Real power isn't exposed by who's talking. It's exposed by what never gets connected, which stories remain isolated, which questions never converge, which conclusions are never allowed to form. Once you see that, Joe Rogan stops being a mystery. He becomes a feature. The system that made Joe Rogan possible didn't do it by accident. It did it by design, not through control, but through incentives, not through censorship, but through filtering. And that raises the final question. If this is how power operates, quietly, structurally, invisibly, what does real resistance even look like? That's not something you'll find in a clip, it's something you have to connect yourself.